Dear Mr. President of the Israel Academy of Sciences and Humanities, Professor Harel, honored committee members, Professor Shmuel, Bilu, Kemp, and Stromsa, dear Michael Eisenstadt, dear colleagues and friends. In the academic landscape of the late 20th century and the early 21st century, Shmuel Noah Eisenstadt occupies a towering position. He has been likened to the classics of sociology in general and to Max Weber in particular. The sheer size of his oeuvre is overwhelming. A bibliography compiled a few years ago comprised 858 publications, among them more than 800 monographs and edited books. Shmuel Noah Eisenstadt was born in Warsaw on the 10th of September 1923. He passed away in Jerusalem on the 2nd September 2010. He came to Palestine with his widowed mother in 1930. He studied at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem in the 1940s. Two of his teachers at the Hebrew University were the historian Richard Koebner and, more importantly, the social philosopher Martin Buber. As for Koebner, he was an interesting combination, as far as I've been able to ascertain, of a medieval historian and a modern historian. Thus, he wrote on state formation and urban development in medieval Europe, but he also was the author of a very significant book that is both historical, political, and conceptual historical on imperialism, with a focus on the period 1860 to 1940. As for Martin Buber, he had among his teachers scholars such as Wilhelm Dilthey and Georg Simmel, and his importance for Shmuel Eisenstadt cannot be exaggerated. It was through Buber that Eisenstadt first came to devote himself to studies of Max Weber. This came to exercise a formative influence on his intellectual pursuits. Shmuel Eisenstadt presented his doctoral dissertation in sociology at the Hebrew University in 1947. He then spent a postdoctoral year, 1947-48, at the London School of Economics and Political Science, where he pursued his early interest in Max Weber's comparative historical sociology, together with Edward Shills. He also was introduced to the British tradition of comparative historical analysis. He took up a position at the Hebrew University upon his return to Jerusalem as assistant lecturer in the Department of Sociology, headed by Martin Buber. Shmuel Eisenstadt continued to teach at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem until 1990. He was chairman of the department from 1951 to 1969, dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences between 1966 and 1969, and holder of the Rose Isaacs Professorship of Sociology from 1959 till his formal retirement in 1990. In a long and distinguished academic career, he has been a visiting professor at universities across the world, including Harvard University, MIT, University of Chicago, University of Michigan, Stanford University, University of Washington, and universities and centers for advanced study in the Netherlands, Sweden, Norway, Italy, Germany, Switzerland, but also in China, India, Japan, Latin America, Austria, and Australia. He was a member of this academy, the Israeli Academy of Sciences and Humanities, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Philosophical Society, the US National Academy of Sciences. He received the Baltzan Prize already in 1988, the Max Planck Research Award for Social Sciences in 1994, the Amalfi Prize in Sociology in 2004, and the Holberg International Memorial Prize in 2006. The latter, incidentally, is, I think, the closest you can come to a Nobel Prize for the area of the social humanities and social sciences at large, and is, in even in monetary terms, very substantial, roughly 2/3 of that of a Nobel Prize. He has been awarded a number of honorary doctorates, namely at Harvard, Duke, Warsaw, Helsinki, Tel Aviv, Hebrew Union College, and Central European University in Budapest. I will say one or two words about his early writings. In his introduction to his book about power, trust, and meaning, Shmuel Eisenstadt quotes Martin Buber and argues that for both of them, the central focus of research has been the problem of human creativity and its limitations. And this is a very important feature that runs through Eisenstadt's entire scholarly endeavors, and that marks a characteristic that distinguishes him from very many other social scientists. But there is a direct link between this commitment and that of his teacher, Martin Buber. I also want to mention a few of the earliest books that he wrote. One such book is from Generation to Generation, Age Groups and Social Structure, that appeared in the first edition in 1956. A major focus in this book is on the tension between particularistic and descriptive principles, which regulate kingship and kinship, and universalistic and meritocratic principles regulating broader societal interactions. The range of attention in this book is extremely broad and includes not only modern societies, but also hunter-gatherer societies, as well as ancient Greece. The emphasis is on the revolutionary and integrity potentials of youth movements, with a special focus on Israel and Germany. This book was written before the youth revolt of the 1960s and of the recruitment of youth to different varieties of fundamentalist and jihadist movements some 50 years later. It stands out as a landmark of sociological inquiry. It deals with a problem that 100 years ago and more was very central to social scientists across the world. I'm thinking of works such as Edvard Spranger's work on the psychology of the youth years, Psychologie der Jugendjahre, on the works of Georg Simmel, and not least works by Karl Mannheim. To some extent, these works have been neglected, I feel, in recent decades. However, shortly after Shmuel Eisenstadt's death, there was a session of the German Sociological Association at its annual conference, at which the German sociologist Bernd Giesen and I were among the speakers. Present were also a large number of other scholars, including the distinguished Weberian scholar Rainer Mario Lepsius. Lepsius on this occasion made, I think, the very important point that this work and some other of Shmuel Eisenstadt's early work very much deserve more attention than they have gotten up till now. One scholar who actually works in this tradition is, in the present age, is the Berkeley geographer Michael Watts, who has used some of these ideas in a study of Boko Haram and jihadist movements in present-day Nigeria. Now, I will not go through a detailed account of every single book of Shmuel Eisenstadt. I did that to a very small extent in my contribution to a book that was published in 2017, when I argued that Shmuel Eisenstadt is probably the nearest we can come to a contemporary sociological classic. Instead, I shall try to extend the context against which it is possible to assess his significance and his originality. And I will do this by looking at developments of the social sciences in the course of the last 100 years, or rather from the beginning of the former century, that is the 20th century, and up until the present. And I will focus on three transformative periods during this long stretch of years. But I would like to start by saying that the social and human sciences, in the form in which we know them today, that is, as university-based and professionally consolidated domains of knowledge, were shaped in a very particular period of human history, namely in the decades around the former turn of a century. This period is exceptional. Never before, nor later, have the societies of Western and Central Europe occupied an equally dominant position in the global context, not only of political power, but of economic influence, even in demographic terms, in terms of the share of the global population that this area of the world could account for, and of course in the production of knowledge and research. If you would have drawn up at the former turn of the century a list of the 20 most important universities, it is unlikely that more than perhaps 1 or 2 American universities would have appeared on that list. The rest of them would have been European. This dominance came to be reflected in the premises and in the basic conceptual apparatuses of the social and human sciences. Since the last decades of the 20th century, this fact has been widely recognized. Yet, surprisingly few efforts have been undertaken to rethink these domains of scholarship from the vantage point of intellectual traditions leading up to the present global landscape of a number of broad societal constellations with different civilizational origins, partially collaborating, partially locked in contestation with each other. A starting point, however, must be a critical view of the theoretical imaginations that have exerted an overpowering and often misdirected influence on historical and social sciences and social theory. I shall focus on some such master narratives in the modern Occident and its relationships to its own history and that of other regions of the world. It is in all these respects, the scholarly oeuvre of Shmuel Noah Eisenstadt stand out as deeply impressive. There are few scholars to the same extent who throughout their careers have focused on areas outside of the North Atlantic regions. Actually, Shmuel Eisenstadt tells that when he studied at the Hebrew University with Martin Buber, one of the first books they had to read was the book by Lao Tse, sort of a book, one of the critical books in the Taoist tradition. That was very unusual at that time, I can tell. I think the time is now ripe for an assessment of recent efforts at achieving an overall view of context of different parts of development across the globe in this period that I discerned. That is against the background of 3 deep reorientations in the interpretation of the Occident's self-understanding of its history and of its position and historiography relative to other parts of the world. Shmuel Eisenstadt's work is relevant to all these endeavors. One pivotal time for the efforts at reconsidering the nature and pathways of world religions and civilizations occurred in the decades around the former turn of a century. Another critical period is the time around the middle of the 20th century, with the so-called behavioral revolution and the efforts of some sociology, notably Talcott Parsons, to establish master narratives that came to influence the social sciences at large. And finally, the first decades of the 21st century, that is our own current period of time. Each of these periods have as a background profound transformations in global patterns of appropriation, trade, and domination, but also shifting cultural and academic landscape. I shall try to highlight some of these shifts and contestations as they are reflected in the writings of a few prominent, you might even say archetypical scholars during each of the 3 transformative periods. And then I shall use this concept to gain a better understanding of the stature and the position of Shmuel Eisenstadt's work. So the half-century preceding the First World War was an age in which countries of Europe and North America underwent rapid change on an unprecedented scale. The context with subtropical, tropical, and subarctic areas of the globe tended to change from being largely commercial and colonial into becoming increasingly intrusive and imperialist. It is in this area that parts of the social sciences became professionalized in terms of associations, academic institutionalization, and, if on a limited scale, go through a period in which basic conceptual categories are formulated, contested, and sometimes standardized. One important element in this search for means to make sense of others of forms of life, other forms of life, and of believing and doing outside of the North Atlantic region concern the role of religion. In this discussion, different assumptions about the origins and historical trajectories of world religions had to be clarified, but also assumptions about the modern world more generally. Ernst Troeltsch and Max Weber, and of course Émile Durkheim, are some of the scholars whose contributions are crucial to this debate. Now, I will come back to them in a moment. In the middle of the 20th century, the societal and scholarly terms of this debate were radically reformulated. It is in this changing context that Karl Jasper's work on the origin and goal of history was published in book form and later came to be diffused. In some ways, it represented continuities relative to the works of Troeltsch and Weber. In other ways, it differed profoundly. I shall then relate continental European discussions about the Axial Age to the works and views of the leading sociologist and exponent of modernization theory in the American context, namely Talcott Parsons. I shall highlight the ways in which a natural link between continental European and American scholars about the study of world religions, civilizations, and the idea of the Axial Age failed to materialize in these years. And again, the oeuvre of Shmuel Eisenstadt is crucial in this discussion, and his links across the Atlantic are also very important. Third, I shall also analyze some features of current scholarly debates about world religions and civilizations against the background of ruptures in patterns of global economic power and hegemony, but also shifts in the intellectual landscape and of ensuing conceptual contestations of a new type. I shall finally indicate some features of an emerging scholarly consensus on prerequisites for further efforts to articulate the way of writing a contextually sensitive history and sociology of periods of cultural crystallization in world history. In epistemic terms, the early 20th century was a period in which, and I use here the account of the intellectual historian H. Stuart Hughes in a now classical overview, Consciousness and Society, described this period as one in which an earlier confidence in the universal applicability of a naturalistic and positivistic program to all domains of scholarship was waning, despite advances across a range of fields in the natural sciences. At the same time, a variety of programs for the incipient social sciences were competing with each other. In this context, I can only very briefly refer to the works of Troeltsch in this context. Ernst Troeltsch was one of the key representatives of the so-called historical school in German theology, a school which pleaded for the introduction of teaching about outer religions from outside the Eurocentric area and allowing for a debate about theological presuppositions and belief presuppositions across a much wider range of phenomena than was at that time customary. This proposal was by many people seen as completely scandalous. That included not only conservatives, but also a leading liberal such as Adolf von Harnack, who later became the first president of what is now the Max Planck Society, which was then called the Kaiser Wilhelm Society. He saw that this was simply a scandalous proposition. However, Troeltsch pursued this program, and he was one of the first, if not the first, major German professor who was invited officially to give a series of lectures in the United Kingdom after the First World War. Thus, he gave 5 such lectures that were given at London, Oxford, and Edinburgh. The first lecture was delivered in Oxford in 1920, and it had the title, and I now make it immediate translation from the German, The Position of Christianity Among the World Religions. It is a fascinating account. It contains a very strong plea, not only for context and dialogue between representatives of different world religions. There is also a vision of the elaboration through such context of a quest for a deeper understanding of questions of human dignity as they appear from within given traditions. each with its own tacit presuppositions and its place within a certain cultural and societal context. What Trelch, in the last instance, does is that he articulates a vision that the end results of such communicative interaction across these boundaries of belief might be something much more significant than a vague generalization of values. Rather, it would contain the possibility of the emergence of a new conception of the sacredness of the person out of the particular conceptions of different forms of universalism inherent in different world religions. Hans Joas has in another context argued that it's precisely communication and interaction of this type that gave rise to the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. In contrast to Trelch, Max Weber came to develop a program for the comparative study of world religions, but also of the cultural worlds, that is, the civilizations in which these religions formed a significant part. The most extensive scholarly work, which was prepared for publication by Max Weber himself, is not Economy and Society, but it is his collected essays on the sociology of religion, which came out shortly after his death in 1920. It's 3 volumes that came out in 1920 and 1921. There's an obvious parallelism between the limitation in terms not only of temporal foci, but in terms of the very objects of inquiry between Weber's overview and later works of the axial age, particularly those works that have been elaborated primarily by Robert Bellah and Shmuel Eisenstadt. While the point of departure for Weber's project is the objective to formulate and examine an argument about the causes of specific forms of capitalism in the modern world, a major share of the pages of the 3 volumes have a focus on the transformations that occurred in the period which many historians of world religions have come to call the axial age. There is, in fact, I would argue, a tremendous tension, Shmuel Eisenstadt would have said, a great antinomy between the declared final objective of, or aim of these volumes and the actual account on the many pages of them. This focus on what we now term the axial age is true for almost all of the 3rd volume, which deals with ancient Judaism. Excuse me. It is also true for most of the 2nd volume, which has a focus on Hinduism and Buddhism. As for the 1st volume, it has a very complex structure, with more than 20% of the 573 pages devoted to the 4 introductory, intermediary, and concluding sections, each one with its own tone and emphasis, and 1 long section on Confucianism and Taoism. And then in the very start, there is a modified and slightly revised version of the 2 famous essays published in 1905 and 1906 on the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism, and the one on the Protestant sects and the spirit of capitalism. The latter one is basically an anthropological study of American society. Weber was one of the many German academics who visited the United States in connection with the World Exhibition and also with the Olympic in St. Louis in 1904. But contrary to many others, he didn't adopt a position of self-congratulation, but rather a very critical attitude. And he tried to understand the cohesive elements of American society, which to a large extent have to do with also the religious affiliation of different members of the society. Now, I would like to say in this context a few words about the analogies that often have been drawn between Max Weber and Shmuel Noah Eisenstadt. So let us first turn to the question of style. If you read Weber's works, you will be struck by its particular tone. It is affirmative, it is self-confident, and it is precise. It is a tone of somebody. In Weber's case, this is actually an account of his own career. Weber was trained both as a legal scholar and as an economist, and some of his early expertise deals with the questions of commercial law. And it's really written in the style which a legal scholar could write. But There are also paradoxical elements. Weber's terminology throughout the collected essays contains many idiosyncratic terms. And sometimes there is a striking lack of definition, including the key concept of rationality. And there are also sometimes surprising statements which are asserted with great confidence, but without really a firm grounding. The reasons for the validity of these statements is simply taken for granted. One example of this is when Max Weber says that the crucial interest of his throughout these essays is the problem of theodicy. And then he goes on to say that there are three and only three principal solutions to the problem of theodicy. And one is contained in Hinduist religion. Another one will be found in Zoroastrianism, essentially, sort of, or Weber doesn't use the word Zoroastrianism, he used the word Zarathustraism, but that is the same. Sort of a Gnostic form of religion where you do not assume that the benevolent God is omnipotent, but that there are different forces that are in contestation in this world and in the world beyond. And then it says another third and final form of solution to the problem of theodicy is contained in Calvinist religion. And these are just assertions that are made. I mean, I think anybody who has studied anything of the history of religion would be able to come up with several other versions. And some people might even say that the solution or so-called solution contained in Calvinism seems to have highly arbitrary elements. How is this a solution if you, at the same time as the Calvinists do, have an idea that the fate of human beings is really prescribed from the start? Human actions will not affect that. They may search for signs that they are among the chosen ones, and they did. But these are just examples that there is a striking elements, a tension in Weber's writing between precision on the one hand and striking lack of definition and argument to sustain those assertions. Now, in Shmuel Eisenstadt's language, you find different features. So I would say Eisenstadt's language is probing, it's explorative, and it teases out possible counter instances. And I think it's absolutely clear that this is a feature where Eisenstadt has been greatly inspired by Buber, incidentally, the first president of the Israel Academy of Sciences and Humanities. And Buber, in turn, I think, was affected by his belonging to the circle around Georg Simmel, where you had scholars of very different orientations, including a Marxist such as Ernst Bloch, and another Marxist as Georg Lukács. You had also Karl Mannheim in this circle, and Simmel himself was also a person who was prone to think in terms of possible counter instances to his argument. But this is striking. And incidentally, I will not talk very much about Robert Bellah, who is in a sense represents a parallel trajectory to that of Shmuel Eisenstadt, but Bellah has not at all this style of writing. So you can read some paragraphs and you can immediately tell if they are written by Bellah or by Eisenstadt. Finally, I would say that there is another issue which is absolutely fundamental, and that has to do with the question of creativity and agency. I just quoted the notion that Buber articulated about the need to focus on human creativity and institutions that allow for and enhance the full flourishing of such creativity. Weber had also an orientation to human action. He wanted an action-based, overarching social theory. But his conception of action is very different from that of Buber. It is one that human beings may end up in a situation where they are basically prisoners of the particular social networks in which they are stuck and constrained. So again, I would think there is a close relationship between Simmel, Buber, and Eisenstadt in this respect. Incidentally, it has had a great importance also to one of the most significant intellectual contestations of the first half of the 20th century. I refer to the famous Davos Winter School of 1929, where the two protagonists were Martin Heidegger and Ernst Cassirer. A school that went on for several weeks, and I think that many of the participants came away from that with the impression that the slightly older Cassirer, accommodating, reasoning, and willing to compromise, in a sense, had been overtaken by this dynamic, energetic, younger Heidegger. I think that is a mistake. And I think the American historian of philosophy, Peter Gordon, in his book, Continental Divide, Heidegger, Cassirer, and Davos, has beautifully illustrated this, where the two basic conceptions used by Gordon is that the one which he ascribes to Heidegger, namely Geworfenheit, sort of thrownness, being thrown into the world, whereas the one he ascribes as characteristic on the most fundamental level of Cassirer's theorizing is that of spontaneity, creativity. And there's no doubt that in this respect, both Buber and Cassirer and Eisenstadt is in the camp that emphasize human agency and human possibilities. Now, I would say then that Weber's study of the great world religions, I will not say anything more about that for the moment, but I would say that that interest in global history that are represented is striking. So Weber's 3 volumes really constitute a synthesis of the knowledge in the language worlds of English, German, and French at around the decades of the first decades of the 20th century. And Weber says in the preface to the volumes also that the expert in any of these fields will not learn anything, but it is a very impressive synthesis of all that knowledge, and then it is put into an analytical framework where the ultimate objective is to account for the emergence of modern industrial capitalism. I don't think that objective is even nearly attained, but it is an extremely valuable critical analysis of the belief systems of different parts of the world, also outside of, or mostly outside of the European and North American area. So, in the decades after the Second World War, there is a very interesting development when a prominent German scholar who came from the circle around Max Weber, I'm talking about Karl Jaspers, published a very small book with a strange title or intriguing title, The Origin and Goal of History. It came out in its original language in 1949, and it had its first edition in English only in 1954 by Yale University Press. And it would take quite a long time before another edition came out of it. Now, Jaspers had come as a young student of medicine to Heidelberg to meet with Max Weber, essentially, and he came to be a key member in the circle around Max Weber. He became a professor of psychiatry and subsequently of philosophy. He gave the oration in memory of Weber in the aula in the Great Hall of the University of Heidelberg the following month after Weber had died on the 14th of June, 1920. And he remained a key member of the Weber circle. However, in the period after the Second World War, Jaspers, who had been in exile, his wife was Jewish, in Switzerland during the war, he resumed his engagement with questions of higher education and learning, He was an active also with, among others, Max Weber's younger brother Alfred, in trying to resurrect the University of Heidelberg, which had been a relatively liberal university in the Weimar Republic. Jasper's book on the origins and goals of history is one of the first systematic efforts by leading European intellectuals to outline a notion of history that explicitly rejects a Eurocentric or a Christocentric account of world history. He pointed to the relative simultaneity of the emergence of several high cultures of the old world in the centuries around the middle of the first millennium BC, of the emergence of distinctly new modes of thought. These new modes displayed a greater reflexivity that went decisively beyond those that characterized mythic thinking that had dominated earlier forms of beliefs. Now, one other person who had sought contact with the Weber circle in the 1920s was an American economist and sociologist, Talcott Parsons, who also actually wrote his doctoral dissertation in Heidelberg and finished that in 1927, and had as one of his teachers at Heidelberg precisely Karl Jaspers. Talcott Parsons, however, became a professor at Harvard University. In 1944, he became appointed to the main professorship in sociology and succeeded the Russian-born Petrim Sorokin, who had been was in exile from the Soviet Union. He also created, that is, Parsons created a new department of social relations comprising scholars from anthropology, psychology, and sociology. This was set up in 1946. And for a quarter of a century, this department and Parsons' theorizing was absolutely crucial to the situation of the social sciences generally. Parsons was arguably the most prominent and influential sociologist in the United States for at least a period of a quarter of a century and possibly for longer, and exerted a tremendous influence also in other parts of the world. Parsons had studied, as I mentioned, in Heidelberg, but there was very little, if any, cross-referencing between Parsons and Jaspers. Parsons wrote actually an article about Jaspers in the final biographical volume of the International Encyclopedia of the Social Sciences. This encyclopedia had been coming out in the late 1960s and was, in a sense, very much centered around Parsonian social science. But an extra volume came out 10 years later, and Parsons has I think, an enigmatic and seemingly very generous, but I think in reality not at all very generous article about Jaspers. In the 1960s, there were criticisms was beginning to rise against Parsonian modernization theory, structural and functional analysis. It was argued that it had an inbuilt conservative bias, that it could not account for microphenomena, that it was unable to account for ruptures on a macro-societal and historical level. Now, as a result of that, in a response to that, there was a series of seminars that was given at Harvard, especially in the spring semester of 1963. There was a series of seminars devoted to the theme of evolution. And the teachers for these seminars was Talcott Parsons, Robert Bellah, and Shmuel Noah Eisenstadt. 1 year later, in the summer of 1964, they published the outcome of this. And these 3 articles by these authors were the central piece of a special issue of the American Sociological Review, which many scholars argue is one of the most interesting publications in the second half of the 20th century in American sociology. And they are strikingly different. Whereas Parsons, and even more so Bellah, embraces evolutionary thinking, Eisenstadt emphasizes very much in the tradition of Buber the role of agency, human agency, and the contingency of societal developments. Parsons then, in 1966, publishes a book which is called Societies, Evolution and Comparative Perspectives. It's a very slim book, just a little more than 100 pages, where in a sense he compresses world history into his own analytical categories. He also uses the term seedbed societies in referring to ancient Israel and Greece, but he never ever refers to Jasper's notions of axial age societies. It is to be noted that roughly at the same time as the seminars at Harvard were given, Shmuel Eisenstadt publishes his early magnum opus about empires. This earned him a recognition across the world. It is a very impressive work that covers global historical developments, but it's also a very detailed institutional analysis where one focus is the degree to which the rulers that be have control over free resources, which in ascriptive societies often just are held back by previously designated social strata. The terminology in this book is still very much Parsonian, but it goes way beyond Parsons' analysis. Now, if I were to say something about the new interest, what one often of Eisenstadt is that in these years, his chief academic interest moved from dealing with comparative institutional historical sociology to the study of dynamics of civilizations. This, however, I think is a smooth transition, and it occurs roughly, I would say, in the course of the 1970s. In the early 1970s, Shmuel Eisenstadt had formed a friendship or a close acquaintance with Stephen Graubard, who was the editor of Daedalus, the Journal of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. And Shmuel had actually edited also an important issue of that. In 1975, this journal published a special issue on wisdom, revelation, and doubt in the first millennium BCE. And the main author of that, there were a number of very famous scholars were contributors to this, but the key person in this endeavor was the Harvard sinologist Benjamin Schwartz. And I haven't looked at archival sources, but it is impossible that Eisenstadt wouldn't have very carefully read this issue and that he studied it carefully. And in just a few years later, namely, he started a project on cultures of the axial age. It came out in 5 volumes in German. The first one came out in 1985, and it dealt precisely with the axial age societies. The prefaces for that is written in 1984, and in January, 8th of January to be precise, in 1983, there had been a so-called Reimers conference where these issues had been discussed, and invitations must have gone out at least a year earlier, that is in 1981, 1980. So I think it's safe to say that by the end of the 1970s, the transition from the interest in comparative institutional analysis to a study of the dynamics of civilizations and greater issues very similar to those of Weber's classical work had been accomplished. Together with the prominent Weberian scholar Wolfgang Schluchter, Weber also made the idea of the axial age a sustained research program in the 1990s. And I became sort of a third member of that program where our meetings changed all the time between Jerusalem, Uppsala, and Erfurt, where Schluchter at the time was a founding director of the Max Weber Colleague. And we also involved later on the European University Institute in Florence. So a very large number of publications came out of this in fields such as Egypt, and it included scholars from Egyptology, Assyriology, Sanskritic studies, history of religion, sinology, and many others. So it was a very interesting meeting ground of humanistic scholars and social science generalists. Shmuel Eisenstadt published in 1986 a first overview work on the studies of the Axial Age, the origins and diversity of Axial Age civilization. Parallel to that, the range of books in German on the cultures of the Axial Age came out. And within the work in which I, and at least initially, Schluchter were involved, we also came out with a series of publications. And one of those was the publication in a series, the Jerusalem Studies of Religion and Society, which is called Axial Civilizations and World History. Now, I want to say one thing more about Eisenstadt's works. I wouldn't mention a very important work where he looked at the non-axial civilization. That is his book, 1996, on Japanese civilization, A Comparative View. But I would also want to say that Shmuel Eisenstadt was fascinated by the relationship between the formation of modernity and the formation of the Axial Age. And he all the time elaborated parallels, divergences between these two phenomena. Some of us, including myself, think that we had the possibility when we edited the book and the special issue of Daedalus on early modernities to have had a much closer look at the historical conception of particularly European paths of development that Weber presents in his work on in Economy and Society. Because there Weber believes that there is a specific European development that is constituted by feudalism, urban revolution, urban revival, the contestation between Pope and Emperor, and an emergent intellectual interest in the new universities that set the stage for European pluralism. I think that is largely correct, and this is the standard view of the European development that sociologists and economists maintain to this day. But I think it's also badly or seriously limited and constrained and has a bias because it doesn't explore analogous developments in other parts of the world, and there's many of them, not least in East Asia. And that has to do with the fact that the analytical categories are formulated in a way that makes such comparisons impossible. If you read Douglas North's Economic History or Jared Diamond's ideas about guns, germs, and steel, you will see that these assumptions are there. But I think it is extremely important to produce a counter to that. And Johan Arnason and I in particular did that to some extent. We published a triple issue of the journal Medieval Encounters, which later came out in book format, where we argued that the 11th to the 13th century is a period of profound transformations and reinterpretations of the visions within different civilizations or cultural worlds that give rise to new institutional pathways. And this is an interpretation that I think Shmuel was sympathetic but unconvinced, or not fully convinced. But since then, I think it has, at least by many European medievalists and by Byzantinologists, this interpretation has gained a relatively positive reception. Now, I will end by saying the following. At the beginning of the 21st century, it became increasingly evident that questions about the history and future of humankind could not be limited to accounts of the achievements of a relatively small number of North Atlantic societies in the course of the last 2 and 3 centuries. Shmuel knew Eisenstadt's proposal that the implications of a notion of multiple modernities be spelt out, and that ancient history might profit from exploring the hypothesis of an axial breakthrough in human self-reflexivity, emerging at different global locations, reflected such concerns. So did also calls for a renewed reflection on the nature of grounded knowledge vis-à-vis different forms of faith and religious belief, and about the possibilities of human being to use reason and creativity to overcome societal constraints and impositions. Towards the second decade of the century, one towering, I think probably the most well-known sociologist in the world today, namely Jürgen Habermas, a social philosopher, wrote his late magnum opus. The publication coincided with Habermas' 90th birthday. This book, in 2 volumes of nearly 1,700 pages, is called This also a history of philosophy. Only the first volume is translated into English. It came out as late as in November 2023. What Habermas does in these works is creating a complex and rich genealogy of philosophical and ethical traditions that embrace efforts to establish and articulate conceptions of philosophy, entailing the closest possible link between notions of reason and liberty. This involves tracing a genealogy that takes its starting point in the axial age. In fact, the idea of the axial age is introduced by Habermas already in the preface to the first of the two volumes, the one with a focus on the Occidental constellation of faith and knowledge. It is then pursued throughout this volume, being the main theme of the analysis for some 300 pages, as well as recurring in many instances also in the following volume, Rational Liberty, Traces of the Discourse of Faith and Knowledge. So in these works, the idea of the axial age is absolutely central, and it involves an almost book-length chapter on a comparison of axial civilizations in the world of antiquity. So he's very, very close to Weber's work, and is very, very close to Eisenstadt work. In fact, in 2008, after a Congress at the Central European University in Budapest, we had a meeting at the Max Weber Center in Erfurt. Out of this came eventually a book to which Shmuel Eisenstadt contributed. The editors were Robert Bella and Hans Joas, but there were many others present who contributed, including Charles Taylor, Johan Arnason, myself. One participant in the seminar, for the two-day seminar, who did not contribute was Jürgen Habermas, who posed many questions and interacted with us in conversations and took notes, but never wrote anything for the book. And then in 2019, he comes out with a book in which the axial age is really the main focus of the first volume, more than 900 pages long. He has a near book-length section in the first volume devoted to a tentative comparison of axial age world imagination. In this section, Habermas has to focus on the same cultural world that Weber analyzed in his study of ethics, of economy, and world religions, and that, namely, Judaism, Buddhism, Confucianism, and Taoism, but also developments in ancient Greece, and in Israel, of course. Now, Habermas points to the fact that Jaspers had been stimulated in his efforts by Max Weber's studies on the sociology of religion. However, Habermas emphasizes that despite these efforts of Jaspers, it is only with Shmuel Noah Eisenstadt that the historical philosophical concept of the axial age has become the focus of an interdisciplinary research program. Furthermore, he stresses that it's only through the embedding of the concept in this research concept, with social scientists playing a key role, that the seminal nature of the concept has become apparent. Religions are, Habermas continues, not only reflected in the cognitive dimension of imaginations of the world, but are also constitutive for the structuring of early forms of social cultural forms of life in their entirety. Finally, Habermas himself has ventured outside of the Occidental constellation to which he refers. But in this case, it is in this case that his analysis has ushered in a rich genealogy that is pursued by way of a detailed argument at every step. However, it will engender an interest on a global scale, hopefully, that may entice scholars to explore analogous genealogies outside of the Occidental context. And this is Habermas' hope. It will involve historians of philosophy and political thought of other cultural worlds. Habermas' large oeuvre is, in other words, a late but hugely important recognition of the originality of the oeuvre of Shmuel Noah Eisenstadt from a completely unsuspected source who pays the greatest of homages to Shmuel Noah Eisenstadt's work. Thank you so much.